Hello, and welcome back to Boss Economic World, the show where we put on our fiscal x-ray goggles to see the bones of the story behind the blaring headlines. Today, we're jetting over to the United Kingdom, a place famous for its tea, its queuing, and, more recently, its absolutely nail-biting economic dramas. The latest episode in this long-running series? A proper dust-up between the UK's money boss, Chancellor Rachel Reeves, and the world's financial headmaster, the International Monetary Fund. It's a battle of philosophies, a clash of titans, and it all revolves around one, seemingly boring question: how often should the government get its financial report card? Now, I know what you're thinking. Alex, forecasts? Budgets? Isn't that a bit dry? And you'd be right, if this were just about spreadsheets. But it's not. This is about trust, stability, and the ghost of financial chaos past. It's a story about whether you can make an economy less stressful by telling people less about it. So grab your cuppa, settle in, and let's unravel the great British forecasting feud of 2025. Let's set the scene. It's October 16, 2025. The UK economy is, let's say, in a state of managed fragility. After the rollercoaster of the early 2020s, the pandemic stimulus, the energy crisis, the brief but spectacular Liz Truss mini-budget experiment that we'll call the Great British Bond Bonfire of 22, things are calmer. Inflation has been wrestled down from its double-digit peaks to a more manageable, though still sticky, 2.8%. GDP growth is, well, it's growing. At an estimated 0.9% for the year, it's not exactly setting the world on fire, but it's not sinking into the Atlantic either. In this delicate environment, Chancellor Rachel Reeves, the person in charge of the nation's purse strings, has a vision. She wants to bring a sense of zen-like calm and predictability to the UK economy. Her big idea? To have just one major fiscal event per year. One big budget, one moment where the government lays out all its tax and spending plans, and then, and this is the key part, gets on with it for the next 12 months. Her argument is compelling, on the surface. She says the current system, with two major economic and fiscal forecasts a year from the official watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR, creates a cycle of speculation. Think of it like this. In the spring, the OBR puts out a massive forecast. The media goes into a frenzy. Has the Chancellor got more money to spend? Will there be tax cuts? Ooh, the borrowing numbers look a bit dodgy. Then, for months, everyone from business leaders to your Uncle Barry down the pub speculates about what the Chancellor will do in the autumn statement. Then, the autumn statement happens, with another full OBR forecast, and the whole circus starts again. Reeves argues this twice-yearly fiscal soap opera is poison for long-term planning. How can a company decide whether to build that new factory or hire 50 new people when they're constantly waiting for the government to pull a new rabbit out of its hat every 6 months? She believes it creates instability, not clarity. She wants to break the cycle. To do that, she's floating the idea of scrapping one of the OBR's two big forecasts. Sounds reasonable, right? Less noise, more stability. Good for business. What could possibly be the problem? Well, the problem, according to the IMF, is pretty much everything. Enter Vitor Gasper from the IMF, stage left. He's essentially the global hall monitor for government finances. And when he speaks, markets tend to listen. His message to the UK was polite but firm, the diplomatic equivalent of a teacher telling a student, "I understand your reasoning, but the answer is still no." The IMF's position is that while having one budget decision a year is fine, in fact, they actively encourage it for stability. Having two forecasts a year is non-negotiable. It's what they call best international practice. Why? It boils down to one word: transparency. To understand the IMF's nervousness, we need to hop in the Boss Economic World time machine and go back to that fateful autumn of 2022. The then government of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng unveiled a massive package of unfunded tax cuts, the now infamous mini-budget. But they did something unprecedented and, in hindsight, catastrophic. They refused to let the OBR publish an independent forecast alongside it. They basically walked into the world's most sophisticated financial market, shouted, "We're going to borrow £45 billion and don't worry, it'll all be fine, trust us," and refused to show their math. The market's reaction was swift and brutal. It was like watching a bomb go off in the UK's bond market. The cost of government borrowing, the interest rate on what are called gilts, shot through the roof. The pound plummeted. The Bank of England had to step in with an emergency £65 billion package to stop pension funds from collapsing. It was an unmitigated disaster, a self-inflicted wound of epic proportions, all born from a lack of credible, independent scrutiny. That scar tissue is still incredibly sensitive. So when a UK chancellor, any chancellor, even one with a reputation for fiscal prudence like Rachel Reeves, starts talking about reducing the amount of OBR scrutiny, alarm bells don't just ring at the IMF, they sound a full-blown, red alert siren wailing klaxon. Gasper's message is clear: you can't build market confidence by giving the market less information. The OBR isn't just a bean-counting agency, it's a credibility anchor. It's the independent referee that tells the world whether the government is playing by its own rules. Trying to sideline it, even a little bit, looks suspicious. It makes investors wonder, what are you trying to hide? So we have a classic standoff. Reeves wants stability through less frequent fiscal drama. The IMF wants stability through maximum transparency. But to really get to the core of why Reeves is so keen on this change, we need to talk about a concept called fiscal headroom. Imagine you're driving a massive truck down a very narrow lane. The space you have on either side before you scrape the wall is your headroom. Now, imagine your GPS, let's call it the OBR, updates you on the width of the lane every 5 minutes. 1 minute it says you have 10 inches of space. The next, a new satellite reading comes in, and it says, correction, you now have only 1 inch of space. Suddenly, you're white-knuckling the steering wheel, forced to slow to a crawl or even stop and reverse. This is the position Rachel Reeves finds herself in. She has set her own fiscal rules, primarily that the UK's national debt must be falling as a percentage of the economy in 5 years' time. The OBR is the independent body that judges whether she's on track to meet that rule. The problem is, her headroom, the amount of money she can spend or cut taxes by without breaking her rule, is ridiculously small. The article mentions it was, at one point, just £9.9 billion. Now, £9.9 billion sounds like a lot of money to you and me. But in the context of a £2.8 trillion UK economy, it's a rounding error. It's the financial equivalent of finding a forgotten fiver in your winter coat pocket. Let me put that in perspective. The UK's annual government spending is over £1.2 trillion. The OBR's forecasts for things like GDP growth, inflation, and tax receipts can change by tens of billions of pounds based on tiny shifts in assumptions. A slightly gloomier outlook on productivity growth, or a small uptick in projected interest rates, can wipe out that £9.9 billion headroom in a keystroke. And this has happened to Reeves twice. One OBR forecast says, congratulations, you have £15 billion of headroom. The lane is wide, and the next one, just 6 months later, says, whoops, our economic model now thinks long-term interest rates will be 0.2% higher, so your headroom is now minus £5 billion. You've hit the wall. When that happens, the Chancellor is trapped. To get back on the right side of her own rules, she is forced to announce painful measures, either tax rises or spending cuts, that she might not have otherwise wanted or needed to make, all because of a change in a forecast. This is the destabilizing cycle she's talking about. She's being forced to swerve the truck every 6 months because the GPS keeps changing its mind about the width of the road. Her proposed solution, maybe a shorter-term forecast or one that just looks at the changes, is an attempt to stop these huge swings. But the IMF sees this as trying to fix the problem by looking at the GPS less often. Their view is, if the road is narrow, you need more information about where the walls are, not less. So, who's right? To answer that, we have to zoom out and look at the UK's overall financial health in 2025. The IMF, despite its warning on the forecasting process, was actually quite complimentary about the UK's broader fiscal position. They said the plans for gradual fiscal stabilization strike a good balance. They even welcomed the emphasis on public investment. But here's the big number: the IMF projects the UK's public debt to GDP ratio will stabilize at 105.5%. UK, 105.5%. USA, 125%. Japan, 260%. Germany, 65%. France, 110%. As you can see, 105.5% is high. It's significantly higher than Germany's, but it's not in the stratosphere like Japan's, and it's lower than the US. It's in the uncomfortably high but manageable zone. Crucially, the IMF points out that the UK benefits from liquid and deep bond markets with a diversified investor base. This is financial jargon for, people around the world still trust you enough to lend you vast sums of money at reasonable interest rates. This is the UK's superpower, its get-out-of-jail-free card. But as the 2022 mini-budget proved, that trust is fragile. It can be shattered overnight. This is the tightrope the UK is walking. It has a high debt burden, which means it relies on continuous, smooth access to global financial markets. To keep those markets happy, it needs to be seen as a paragon of stability and predictability. This brings us back to the central conflict. Reeves's argument, the current process of twice-yearly high-stakes forecasting creates domestic instability, which is bad for the economy and ultimately bad for market confidence. The IMF's argument, changing that process to reduce transparency would spook international investors, which would be catastrophic for market confidence. They both want the same thing: a stable, trusted UK economy. They just have fundamentally different ideas about how to maintain that trust. So, where do we land on this? Is Chancellor Reeves a prudent manager trying to calm a chaotic system, or is she a pilot trying to black out one of the cockpit windows for a less distracting flight? While her frustration with the fiscal headroom soap opera is entirely understandable, her proposed solution carries immense risk. The ghost of 2022 looms too large. In the current global environment, any move by a major economy to reduce the power and frequency of its independent fiscal watchdog would be viewed with extreme suspicion by the very markets the UK needs to keep on side. The irony is that the IMF agrees with her goal. They said it themselves, budget decisions should be yearly. But the evaluation of those decisions, the health checkup, needs to be more frequent. Perhaps the real solution lies not in scrapping the forecast, but in reforming how politicians and the media react to it. It's about changing the political culture to treat the spring forecast as what it is, an update, a progress report rather than a starting gun for a new round of budget speculation. It's about educating the public that forecasts are not destiny, they are snapshots in time that are guaranteed to change. Ultimately, Chancellor Reeves is caught between a rock and a hard place. She's trying to steer the massive ship of the UK economy through narrow, treacherous waters. Her desire to stop the crew from panicking every time the depth sounder beeps is logical. But the IMF, acting as the global coast guard, is warning her that turning the depth sounder off is the surest way to hit a rock. In the high-stakes game of global finance, credibility is everything. And right now, for the UK, the OBR's twice-yearly dose of harsh, independent reality is a price well worth paying for it. So, is the Chancellor trying to create calm, or is she inadvertently paving the way for a different kind of chaos? The truth is, she's trying to solve a real problem, but her proposed solution might just create a much, much bigger one. That's all we have time for today on Boss Economic World. It's a fascinating dilemma with no easy answers. What do you think? Is this a sensible move for stability or a risky gamble with transparency? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, if you want to keep making sense of the madness of the global economy, be sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Until next time, stay curious.